All right, welcome. This MCLE is called Maybe We Are a Church. We are the Sustainable Economies Law Center. My name is Tia Taruk Myers. I am the Director of Legal Education at the Law Center, and I have some clients who have wondered if they're a church and have become a church.
Hi, my name is Erica Sato. I'm a staff attorney at the Law Center, and I've also been working with those same clients. And Tia and I mostly work with our land-based clients, and we found that this can be a really helpful entity format for them.
Exactly. And first, we'd like to thank our interpreters. We have ASL interpreters here. Um, Let me see. Interpretation is difficult work that requires a ton of skill and energy and is essential to keeping our events accessible. We are so thankful y'all are here. We're also thankful to our sponsors. Without these donors, we wouldn't be able to put on events like this. And then, do you want to go over the agenda, Erica?
Yeah. Um, so we're gonna start. We did our introductions. We'll talk a little bit about the background behind uh, why we want to use the church form or why we might not, the political elements. Then we'll back up into the an overview of entities. What is an entity? What are we actually talking about? And then we'll get into the nuts and bolts, the pros and cons of being a church, um, the church tests, meaning how to know whether you might qualify as a church, um, the process for applying to become a church or claiming church status, a few examples and resources, and then we won't do any Q&A today because this is for the recording. So, why are we talking about this topic now? Well, we think that in this political moment, churches could be a really strategic option for a lot of different groups that do happen to meet the relevant tests. Um, if you don't meet the tests, then it's not a good option. But if you do, that offers a lot of benefits. One would be it's possible that right-wing governments are kind of just less likely to go after churches in general, versus other kind nonprofits because of, how it looks politically. Another is that we actually have seen the Supreme Court moving towards more latitude and less stringent rules for churches, which they already have some of that. Um, but the Supreme Court recently said that the government has no right to say what is or isn't a valid religious view. So, kind of expanding religious freedoms. Another is that the church form allows you to reduce the number of touch points with the government and information that you need to share with the government. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but new organizations can form without really having to file anything in California. In California, you would need to kind of email a request to the state attorney general for confirmation of exemption, um, and then figure out your state taxes, either paying them or becoming exempt. But that's basically it in terms of the minimum requirements of what you would need to apply for. And we think these things are important because, um, we've been hearing rumors that the IRS might be reviewing nonprofit tax returns or exemption applications and kind of targeting organizations that use key terms and phrases. So, yeah, the church form offers a way to not have to make those filings and deal with the IRS at all. And then also by reducing the different compliance requirements like filing a federal tax return, it's also just less likely that your organization will fall behind and accidentally become out of compliance. Um, so right-wing organizations also use a lot of churches. Um, So it might feel a little bit weird to kind of use this same tool on the left, but we think that our clients who are politically aligned should also benefit from all of these things. So that's why we're teaching this. Um, but that said, going back to the church test, this presentation is definitely best suited for groups that have a really strong shared grounding in spiritual beliefs and values, are concerned about um, the state of the world and think it would be a good strategy for their organizational protection to reduce the amount of information and disclosures that they're sharing. So, to get on the same page about how these things work and what they are, we like to use this cake metaphor. So, you can think of the sponge of the cake as the entity and the icing as the tax status. And you can kind of mix and match the cake and the icing. And then there's also infinite possibilities for the ingredients that you choose to make up your cake and icing. And those are in your internal financial, governance, and operational structure. And these are the things that show up in your policies, practices, and bylaws. So the sponge or the entity is something that you form under state level law. Um, Options that you might have heard of include an LLC, a nonprofit corporation, an unincorporated association, um, a C corporation. If you're a group of people doing something together, then you automatically become an unincorporated association under most state laws. If you want to incorporate as a formal entity, then you would need to register with the Secretary of State. The icing or the tax status is something that you can elect or apply for at the federal level, usually to achieve a particular tax benefit or pay your taxes in a specific way. Um, so this could include the 501(c)s or a variety of non-exempt options. There are some tax statuses that you can just claim, and then there's others that you have to apply for. You can really mix and match the different tax statuses and entity types to find an overall cake that works for you. But we're going to focus for the rest of the presentation today on one particular icing, which is 501(c)(3) church federal status and IRS designation. And that icing can be paired with different kinds of cakes, including unincorporated association or religious corporation. But of course, that will vary at the state level for the cake part. Um, Not to get too confusing, but there are also religious entity types or cakes. So I just mentioned the religious corporation. In California, that's kind of one of them. We won't talk too much about these today, the state level religious entities, but I just want to name that it's possible to have a religious organization that's not a church or a church that's not a religious corporation. So, religious corporations or public benefit corporations in California with 501(c)(3) religious purposes um, might fall into this bucket of religious organization without meeting the tests we described below for being an actual church. So this might be organizations that don't have a congregation, a group of people that regularly meet to engage in worship, but maybe it offers religious education for children or some of these non-church side activities. Um, we won't cover too much on this, but if you check out our guide on religious organizations and churches on our website, um, it has more information about the benefits of religious organizations and kind of talks about the specifics. But basically, this religious organizations are kind of an in between from churches or a regular nonprofit corporation. So they have some of the benefits, but not all of them. Okay, so why might you want to consider being a church? What actually are these benefits that we've been talking about that are a little bit different from regular charitable 501(c)(3) status? Well, the first one that we mentioned is you don't need to apply to the IRS to get this status. Normally, with a charitable C3, you would start by filling out the Form 1023, and then the IRS would send you back a designation letter that says, yes, you are a 501(c)(3). But with churches, you can just claim it, say, I meet the test, I am a church, and that's pretty much it. Um, Now, your funders might still ask you, do you have a letter? So you might want to get one for that reason, but you don't have to. Um, okay, there's other fewer reporting requirements as well. Once you're a church, you don't need to submit an annual tax return to the IRS or at the state level once you get state tax exemption. You don't need to follow the California rules that say um, once you have a $2 million annual budget, you need to get a professional audit. Churches are exempt from that. And in fact, the Attorney General actually does not have oversight over you at all in California. At the federal level, there's also reduced likelihood of an IRS audit, and that's because there are special rules limiting when the IRS is allowed to audit churches. It has to have a little bit more evidence that maybe you're doing something wrong. Um, there's special allowances under RIFRA and RLUIPA, and this is especially kind of related to land use for land holding churches, zoning, and food and safety laws for property managed by the church. There's slightly streamlined property tax exemption applications. Uh, these are still pretty complicated, but a little bit better than for other nonprofits. There's some special rules for clergy. Um, Clergy can have a housing allowance as part of their compensation, and they don't have to report that as income. And then there's a few other exemptions that we won't really get into around how you pay unemployment tax, disability insurance contributions, things like that as an employer organization. On the other hand, the cons to being a church, you might alienate funders or partners by calling yourself a church if they're more secularly oriented. But we do think that offering some education to your funders can help here if you just explain a little bit more about what you mean by church and why you made that shift. In particular, though, it might reduce your ability to get certain government grants because of the constitutional rules around separation of church and state. And then again, you need to make sure that you actually fit the test for being a church, which we'll talk more about later, but not all spiritually inclined organizations are going to fit this. Okay, a little bit more about the filings and disclosures you're exempt from as a church. So in California, the audit requirement you're exempt from as a church. All of the filings with the Attorney General you're exempt from. You just need to email the Attorney General and say, hey, we're a church, here's our governing document, we're exempt, right? And As long as they respond and say, yes, you're exempt, then you're good to go. The annual Form 990, you don't have to file that as a church with the IRS. The annual Form 199, the California tax return, you're also exempt, but that one is not automatic. You have to figure out how to get California state tax exemption by applying for it. Okay, protections from audits. So we had a bit of a hard time trying to find official information about how often the IRS actually audits churches, but the few sources that do exist make it seem very rare. And that's probably because there are statutory protections from audits specifically for churches. So essentially, a high-level Treasury official has to reasonably believe, based on some reliable evidence, that you are not actually really a church or that you have other income that is supposed to be taxed, but that you're not properly reporting. So that's needed just to open an investigation on a church. So there's no random auditing of churches by the IRS. And then once they establish that there is reasonable belief, um, there's also certain notice requirements. So the IRS needs to give a certain amount of notice about what their concerns are, what information they'll be asking for, what kinds of documents they'll be looking at. And they have to send you an inquiry notice that just lets you know, hey, the IRS is looking at you. And then 15 days later, they'll send you an examination notice with that more detailed information. And then you have another 15 days at least before the start of the examination.
All right. Thank you, Erica. So another reason to form a church is because religious groups have been granted freedoms that aren't available to secular organizations. For example, under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA, members of religious organizations have been allowed to use controlled substances like peyote and ayahuasca in ceremonies. For example, the Church of the Celestial Heart et al. V. Garland. In this case, the Church of the Celestial Heart claimed that ayahuasca was their church's sacramental tea. They sued U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland and other officials last year after law enforcement intercepted their ayahuasca. The judge sided with the church and denied the federal government's motion to dismiss. So, what is RFRA? RFRA states that the government shall not substantially burden a person's exercise of religion, even if the burden results from a rule of general applicability. Lawmakers intended RFRA to apply to both state and federal laws. However, the Supreme Court in City of Bern v. Flores held that applying RFRA to state governments was an unconstitutional exercise of Congress's enforcement power. So now RFRA only applies to federal laws. In response to this case limiting RFRA's scope, 21 states have passed their own RFRA laws, and California is not one of them. Some municipalities in California have decriminalized a lot of hallucinogens, and there may be a medical defense if prosecuted for possession of psychedelics. But in California, a religious defense under RFRA wouldn't work unless a church is dealing with a federal agency. Okay, but this presentation isn't about how to get away with drugs in California. It's about why and how to become a church. So RLUIPA, what is RLUIPA? It is the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. We call it RLUIPA. RLUIPA states that land use laws should not impose a substantial burden on the religious exercise of a person unless the government can demonstrate that the burden on that person is imposed to further a compelling governmental interest and is the least restrictive means of furthering that compelling government interest. So this has often come up in the context of religious groups providing food and shelter to the poor. For example, a church called the Rock Church in Castle Rock, Colorado, set up RVs in their parking lot for homeless people. The Rock Church got cited for violating a local zoning ordinance. They sued the town, claiming it had violated RLUIPA by burdening their religious freedom to care for the poor and needy. Last year, a federal judge sided with the church. 2 months ago, the church and the town reached a settlement in which the town recognized the church's right to continue operating its on-site temporary shelter. And the town also agreed to cover $225,000 of the church's legal fees. So many of our land clients at the Law Center are in the Bay Area, which of course makes housing justice super relevant. And as such, freedoms offered by RLUIPA may be a prime reason for becoming a church. And we will send a link, or we will add a link to the summary of other RLUIPA cases that might be applicable to your group or to your clients' groups. Okay, another reason to become a church is that there may be emerging exemptions to lobbying and endorsement restrictions for religious organizations. All 501c3s, including churches, have certain limitations on lobbying and political speech. In general, 501c3s can lobby politicians in support of specific policies as long as it doesn't exceed a certain percentage of their activities. What they can't do is support specific candidates for office. Just some personal background to keep this a little bit interesting. I drew this nun endorsing Zohran Mamdani because these new IRS court filings made me reflect on how I was raised Catholic while growing up in the Philippines. My great-grandpa was an anti-capitalist freedom fighter who became an atheist when he adopted Marxism, but then returned to Catholicism when he went to a midnight mass in prison. So the Catholic popes have been recently pro-Palestine and critical of unfettered capitalism and greed. This is all what Zohran Mamdani stood for with his democratic socialist platform recently. Therefore, it would make sense for a nun to endorse his campaign. Very recently, new IRS court filings indicate that churches can sometimes speak in favor of or against candidates for political office as long as the statements are made to the congregation in connection with religious services. So that is an exception to the limitations on lobbying rules that apply to most 501c3s unless it's religious. Churches may also have a slightly easier time with property tax exemption than other nonprofits, although this will vary a lot from state to state. In California, it's still a huge pain to apply, but the nice part is that once religious exemption is approved, you only have to submit a really short card every year indicating that nothing has changed. And this is in comparison to how other nonprofits need to submit an annual application every year. Note that rules for what counts as a church are also a little different when it comes to property taxes than the IRS organizational rules. We have an MCLE on how to get property tax exemption, and you'll find them in the links. We also have a bite-sized legal guide on property tax exemption if you just need to skim some rules. Okay, there's special income tax rules for ministers. So usually, if your employer provides you with housing as part of your compensation, the value of that housing is considered a taxable fringe benefit. Ministers may be able to exclude from income tax the rental allowance offered to them as part of their compensation. They can also exclude from income tax the fair rental value of a parsonage that is provided to them as pay for their services. So parsonage is just housing provided by the church. You can exclude the allowance from your gross income as long as you use the amount to rent a home and the amount isn't more than reasonable pay for your services as a minister. You can look up these parsonage rules in detail in IRS publication 517, and we'll have a link on that in the slides. So an example is, let's say this person in purple is Reverend Lane Baker, a full-time minister. The church allows him to use a parsonage that has an annual fair rental value of $25,000. The church pays him an annual salary of $65,000, of which 5,000 is designated by the church for utility costs. Let's say he spends his entire utility allowance. So for income tax purposes, Reverend Baker excludes all of this, both the rental allowance and the used utility allowance, which equals $30,000. This is untaxed income that would normally be taxed. This means Reverend Baker will only have to pay taxes on $60,000. So that's another reason to become a church. Generally, employees of non-religious organizations would have to pay taxes on both the rental allowance and their salary. So instead of only paying taxes on $60,000, this person who is an employee of a non-religious organization would have to pay taxes on $90,000. All right. Okay, so now let me move on to church tests. The IRS has relied on 14 criteria for determining what is a church. And these 14 criteria roughly parallel the questions that the IRS asks on Form 1023. That test is not formally adopted as law, but it is likely quite informative in determining who the IRS deems to be a church. So these are the 14 criteria. It is, hold on, let's see, that an organization has a distinct legal existence, a recognized creed and form of worship, a definite and distinct ecclesiastical government, a formal code of doctrine and discipline, a distinct religious history, a membership not associated with any other church or denomination, an organization of ordained ministers selected after completing prescribed studies, a literature of its own, established places of worship, regular congregations, regular religious services, Sunday schools for religious instruction of the young, and schools for the preparation of its ministers. If your organization satisfy all 14 of these criteria, you will likely be seen to be as a church, but you don't have to satisfy all of them. There's another test called the associational test. It is often used to see if an org is a church. And the associational test asks whether the organization has a regular congregation or community of believers who come together for religious worship. In effect, the associational test narrows in to focus on just a few of the 14 factors that I read earlier. Some of the 14 factors, such as having a Sunday school for religious instruction of the young or having ordained ministers, seem unlikely to make or break a church determination, but they are taken into consideration by legal authorities in determining whether or not something feels churchy. Increasingly, courts and the IRS are using the associational test to determine what is a church, and this test may be currently favored by the IRS in analyzing applications from churches. Um, okay. So for our clients, here are the questions that often stand out in decisions about whether an org passes the church associational test. Does the group bring people together? Do they engage in worship? Do they hold shared beliefs and values? And do they make church activities primary and central to the organization? Um, Erica drew this super cute cartoon to describe some of the gray areas of whether an organization is a church. Do you want to describe the cartoon a little bit?
Sure. So I made this cartoon that references a movie you might recognize because I thought it would be an interesting example for applying our test. So I think we could argue that the burn book here, which was added by Tia, lays out the shared beliefs and values of the plastics. We know that they meet up every Wednesday and they all wear pink. So that should also satisfy the associational test because they have these regular meetings and they know exactly who's a member and who's not. It's sort of a distinct, cohesive group of congregants. They're also saying here in the bubbles that dressing in pink is itself a form of worship to the fashion gods. So that's really important, the worship piece. Um, and then the only remaining question we have is whether worship is a primary activity of the group. I think we would have to think a little bit more holistically about what other activities the plastics engage in and which of those might be worship in order to answer that question. But maybe they have a good shot.
Thanks, Erica. Okay, so let's apply the 14 criteria test and the associational test to two other hypotheticals, not just the plasticals. So the first one is let's call this hypothetical the Universal Care Collective. They are a group of 5 people who meet twice per month to engage practices that affirm and strengthen their belief system. Their shared belief is that humans, all life on Earth, and all matter in the universe are characterized by a pull toward love, care, and creativity. Since this force of love and care is not always visible, the collective engages in rituals, prayer, meditation, songs, and other practices that bring this universal love and care into their awareness, allowing the members to, in turn, act on this awareness throughout their daily lives. To align and flow with the universal love and care, all members of the UCC commit to engaging in free acts of services to the community, including elder care, legal aid, and food redistribution. Erica, is this a church?
I think the answer is yes. We believe that Universal Care Collective would qualify as a church because it has this defined belief system, regular gatherings, a dedicated community of adherents, and religious expression through both ritual and ethical practice. So the group's service activities are not merely charitable because they're a direct response to the organization's religious belief system. The fact that the group is small, only 5 people, is not in and of itself a problem. But if the group is not open to bringing in new members, that could be a problem because the IRS might view it more like a private club. So the members might want to clarify a process for bringing in new members to their collective or opening up other ways for the public to participate in gatherings.
All right. The next hypothetical is a group called Earth Arts, a spiritual nonprofit cultivating a sense of full connection to the earth through arts, education, and spiritual practices. Earth Arts sits on a 10-acre forest site and hosts retreats, artist residencies, and writing workshops that include spiritual instruction and contemplation, ceremonies, and healing practices. These activities are guided by a belief in the complete interconnectedness of all life on Earth. Participants learn about ancestral forms of land stewardship that represent the interconnected worldview, and they engage in practices that heal a sense of connection to ancestors. Participants are guided to make commitments to the stewardship of the earth and to affirm such commitments through their art and writing. Earth Arts is governed by a non-hierarchical collective of people who have committed to maintaining their personal sense of connection to the earth. Erica, is this a church?
Here we're thinking probably not. That's because Earth Arts might satisfy some IRS church criteria, like regular religious services, a defined creed, governance by spiritual leaders. Its educational and retreat offerings offer religious instruction, collective worship practices, and commitments to ethical practices. But It's not clear whether Earth Arts has a community of believers that the IRS would view as a congregation, which again is really important under the new associational test. In cases where an organization only facilitates occasional gatherings or programs that are open to the broad public, but without sort of a regular group of attendees, the IRS has determined that the organization lacks a cohesive body of believers. So, Earth Arts might be more like a spiritually inspired arts and education nonprofit or a religious organization that's not a church. On the other hand, in guiding participants to make commitments to Earth stewardship, Earth Arts might be able to establish a congregation if it establishes a cohort of committed practitioners who meet and practice together regularly. But this cohort would also need to be a primary activity of the organization in order to meet the standards for a church, which might not be possible if it's only one of many programs that the organization hosts.
Thanks, Erica. All right. Would you like to share about how to become a church?
Sure. So, if it's a new organization that doesn't exist yet, we'll first talk about that, and then we'll talk about if you already have an organization, an entity. So if it's a new organization, then first you have to decide on your entity structure. So think back to the cake metaphor, um, the sponge of the cake. You could go with a nonprofit corporation or a religious corporation. If you do that, then you would need to apply with your Secretary of State. Um, If you choose an unincorporated association, on the other hand, which we also have a guide on our website, then you don't need to apply for it. You would just write up your governing document that says, kind of, here are our shared values and beliefs, and here's how we make decisions together. And then you would have the initial members sign it, but you don't need to submit it anywhere. Um, okay, so that's step one, entity formation. So step two for a new organization would be to decide whether or not you want to apply to the IRS for church status. And this can be a little bit of, it's a very personal decision, I guess. Um, so remember that you can just claim church status without applying for it if you want, if you truly believe that you meet the tests that we just described. Um, That's what's shown kind of in this cartoon that I drew here. The group is just declaring itself a church, and that's enough. But it can be helpful to apply sometimes so that you can show funders and partners your letter from the IRS and kind of have that proof that you are a church and you do meet the tests. And then also for your own peace of mind, um, knowing that the IRS agrees that your organization qualifies as a church. Um, and then this also relates to step three, state tax exemption. So for step three, in some states, churches are automatically exempt from state income taxes, and so it could be really simple. You don't have to file anything. But in California, which is where we practice, it's a little more complicated. Churches still have to apply for state tax exemption if they want to be exempt. Um, or they can pay income taxes on their profit without applying for anything, but just submitting a tax return. But the thing is, if you want that exemption, the state tax exemption, then if you applied for IRS tax exemption and you got a letter back from them, then you get to fill out a really short state tax exemption form. Um, it's like one page, and then you attach your exemption letter from the IRS. But if you choose not to apply with the IRS, then you have to fill out a much longer form and explain why you think you're a church in order to get California state tax exemption. And that longer form kind of mimics the IRS application in some ways. So, yeah, that's kind of a consideration. And then going back to the other option of paying your taxes at the state level, you can submit that using the Form 100 every year. And if you choose to pay your taxes at the state level, you can still deduct all of your expenses the same way as you would on a normal nonprofit tax return. So, assuming that you spend the money that you bring in every year and you don't kind of carry it over from year to year, you might not actually have that big of a tax burden. Okay, step 4 is to email the California Attorney General or learn about your own state's um, Attorney General oversight process um, with a copy of your governing document. So in California, they just need to see your governing document and make sure that you're actually a religious organization, and then they should respond confirming that you're exempt from filing statements with them and getting independent audits and any other attorney general oversight. Okay, step 5. There's also an annual filing requirement with the Secretary of State in California, but this only applies to corporations that formed with the Secretary of State, so it wouldn't apply if you're an unincorporated association. And that's pretty much it for becoming a new church. So, what if you're not a new organization, but an existing 501c3 nonprofit that wants to convert into a church? Then there's not as many decision points. Um, you would basically just fill out the IRS Form 8940, request for miscellaneous determination. You can submit that online through pay.gov. And under part 2 of the form, you just check the box that says exemption from the Form 990. That's what means that you don't have to file tax returns in the future. And then you complete the Schedule D, where it says you check the box that says you're a church, and then proceed to Schedule L. And Schedule L is practically identical to um, the application for a new organization for 501c3 church status. So it asks those same 14 questions that Tia talked about beforehand. Um, And prior to submitting this, you should also amend your governing documents to reflect your religious purpose and then attach those documents to the form when you submit it. Okay, we're gonna end with an example of a client that we work with that uses this form. So Sawal Mem is one of our Indigenous land return clients. This is an entity held by the Winnemem Wintu tribe, and we help them form a nonprofit unincorporated association with 501c3 church status. So again, the cake in the cake metaphor, the sponge is an unincorporated association, and the icing is church, 501c3 church. So why did they choose that form? Well, they wanted to be a nonprofit in general because they wanted access to grant funding. That's a really important decision point for a lot of groups. And we do have some more resources on our website as well if you're thinking about that question of whether to be a nonprofit or a for profit. So they chose a nonprofit, but they didn't want to just be a regular 501c3 charitable nonprofit corporation because they had already kind of worked with that form before, and they found it really disruptive to the tribe's traditional decision-making structures and ways of doing things. So using an unincorporated association allowed them to not have a board of directors, but use their own traditional ways of decision making, not have to worry about the California 51% disinterested governing body rule that comes along with California nonprofit corporations. Um, and instead, they just wrote into their organizational document that decisions will be made in the traditional ways of the Winnemem-Wintu tribe. And then as for church status, they also really liked that because it minimized paperwork and administrative burden. Um, and it reduced the amount of information that they need to share publicly. That can be really important for Indigenous groups who we work with, because they often have a lot of really crucial traditional knowledge that is coveted and stolen by settlers and has historically been stolen. And so, they can be really protective over that information. So this is a great benefit to have to not have to share that much information. Um, and then once we unpacked what the IRS is really looking for with the church tests, we realized that it fit well with this group, how they operate and understand themselves. So part of why we want to share this example is to show that churches, um, should have said this up top, but churches don't have to be Christian or, one of the religions that you think of as a traditional religion. It's quite broad, and the spiritual piece can fit a lot of different types of belief systems. But the tricky point is really often the associational test part and whether there's a congregant, a group of congregants that meets regularly to engage in worship.
Thank you, Erica. Um, so before we end, I just want to give a plug for our free donation-based online legal cafes. Hopefully, this presentation wasn't too overwhelming, but it's a lot of information and you have a lot of options. Come to our legal cafes so we can talk through your specific situation with you. And that is the end of our
Okay, what
slides.
are
I'll stop sharing. One question I think was, why was it important for Sawal Mem to not have to worry about the 50% disinterested rule? Or not, maybe not Sawal Mem specifically, but any other organization.
gotcha. Yeah, this is kind of a whole can of worms about conflicts of interest, which we do also have some resources on our website. But a lot of the groups that we work with are, you know, cooperatively run. They believe in mutual aid and sharing resources and having the decision makers of the organization be as close as possible to the people actually receiving the benefits. And ideally, it's the same people, right? So that actually causes a lot of problems under nonprofit law, even though, it kind of makes a lot of sense. There's some tension there because traditionally nonprofit law uses a charity model where it's like we, the um, nonprofit people, have the knowledge and the power and the decision making, and we're going to help you guys, the poor people who need help. And so it's based on this idea that the people who need help are not capable of making decisions like that and shouldn't be allowed to do so, because that would be considered a conflict of interest. So in California, kind of backing up now, in California, there's a rule that for nonprofit corporations, the governing body has to be at least 51% disinterested people. So people who are not being paid by the organization or having any other kinds of like benefits that they're receiving from the organization, really, um, or agreements. And that can be really complicated with what we just talked about. And it also, there's an added piece for like indigenous tribes organizations, because a lot of the times the people running that will be family members. And so then even if one person is getting paid by the organization, then that person and all of their family members would be considered disinterested or interested, sorry. So yeah, so we were trying to figure out some ways to make it just a little bit more flexible.
Thank you. Great answer. Do you remember any questions or have any that you think people might often ask?
Um, let's see. Okay, well, this isn't a question that I remember, but I think maybe something to tease out a little bit more would be if you're in California and you don't, like, how do you make that determination of whether to apply for church status or just claim it, and what to do with the California tax exemption application? It seems like kind of a tricky decision point. Do you have thoughts about that, Tia?
No, I don't. What do you think? Like, I think all of our clients have, or the clients we were like Solomon, for example, they did claim it,
They
right?
applied for it.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
of, from what I remember, because of funders,
Yeah.
which would probably apply to many kinds of people coming to our legal cafes who are thinking about taxes because they have money coming in from funders, maybe to buy land where they will practice their spiritual activities on.
Mm,
But why would a group just not do that? Not
yeah.
apply?
Well, I mean, I think that part of the benefits that we've been talking about for churches is not having to share so much information with the government. There's a concern that the IRS is using tax exempt applications um, for learning more about left wing movements and maybe targeting them. Um, so, in that sense, if you believe that the California government is more aligned, it might make sense to submit your application there instead, even if you would have to pull together a lot of the same information.
I see what you mean. When you talk about the IRS targeting left-wing organizations, by looking at their tax filings, what is the fear that our clients have about the information in their tax filings? Is it just that
Yeah.
the government would revoke their tax status or go after their assets, or like what have we been hearing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think this is all kind of hypothetical, right? I don't think we have heard that this has happened to any organizations that we know of. So it's kind of hard to say, but I guess, yeah, probably the most likely would be just that your application would be denied.
Hmm, okay. Okay. Things to consider.
Yeah. We could talk more about property tax exemption. There's a lot more to say there, but
Sure, we can just start. What would you like to say?
well, we talked about how the application can be a little bit streamlined. Um, but we didn't really get to talk much about the definition being different in California for property tax exemption purposes of a church versus the federal tax definition of a church.
Hmm.
Something that we have been learning about is, well, in California for the property tax definition, um, it says that churches have to be a physical building. Um, but we've been trying to make some more novel arguments about that it could just be land that is actually inherently um, spiritual and sacred, and that the groups working on that land view it as a church for that reason, even though there's not actually any structures.
Mhm.
Um,
We've also tried to use other kinds of structures like fire pits or benches.
mhm. Yeah, and we've had varying success with these arguments. Um, but for California property tax purposes, it is important that you look at the requirements for your organizational documents. There's some limiting additional things, language that you have to put into your organizational documents, because some of the things that are allowable for IRS 501c3 exemption, like education, that's not really a California property tax exempt activity. If you're still here and you're a lawyer, please come to our legal cafes. Um, you can email us and submit a little volunteer form, and then um, we'll match you with clients. And it's just 30-minute consultation windows. If you're new to our volunteer program, you can be paired with other more experienced attorneys for your first couple times coming. So you can learn about how we do it. And it's a really great way to learn about the types of legal issues that we work on at the law center, and also get to meet new people and learn about the exciting projects that they're working on without kind of a long-term commitment. So,
Mhm. Yeah, and the typical questions we get at our legal cafes are about forming worker-owned cooperatives or amending bylaws for certain collectives, or how to start a church or whether a group is a church. That's why we're teaching this MCLE. Other questions are about like housing co-ops and co-living arrangements. And for volunteer attorneys, we have like a whole curated list of MCLEs that can help you feel comfortable advising our clients. But first, we're not going to throw you in with the sharks right away. We would have you shadowing our more seasoned volunteers or our staff attorneys.
and
And
as a volunteer, you get access to our whole library of MCLEs for free.
yes, exactly. And the first one we would advise to watch, which isn't an MCLE, but just a training, is a training on on-the-spot legal advising, and it's trying to help you feel comfortable, like just issue spotting and not actually giving advice for everything a client asks, because we don't know everything, and it's a 30-minute consultation, so the stakes are low, but it really helps our clients. So it'd be great if you volunteer. Thank you.